started to think about undocumentedness as a spectrum, because we need to think about not just undocumentedness as a dichotomy to citizenship. And so undocumentedness is much more complicated, right? There's no easy way to define undocumentedness and no single definition that stands true across the globe. And mindfully, undocumentedness it's not a US specific issue. Like, this is a concern all throughout the world. In the words of Jose Antonio Vargas, who's also an undoc immigrant, if there's an estimated 45 million immigrants living in America, then there are 45 million ways of being an immigrant in America. Like all groups, we are not a monolith. Of those 45 million immigrants, and as per the Department of Homeland Security, 11 million immigrants are currently residing in the United States unauthorized. Borrowing from Jose Antonio Vargas's logic, if there are 11 million ways of being undocumented in the United States. Thus, to completely comprehend undocumentedness, and in the words of Federico, Cuatlacuatl, one must consider undocumentedness a spectrum, which is where things get intricate. So I've created my own working model, and it's by no means perfect. It's where I'm at in this thought process at the moment, because living undocumented evolves over time, right? There are new policies that come and change how we have to think about this community, my community. This past week alone, right, our current administration decided that refugee needs to now be rethought. And this is something that we don't know how to address from within the space yet. So again, it is by no means perfect because it is incredibly complex and it's ever changing. But I think that this is a more humanistic approach that removes me from thinking about people as statuses. Now, I'm going to go and explain just a tiny little bit of how I'm thinking about it. And again, this is a living document. The more I learn, the more it grows. But within undocumentedness, we have people who are unprotected, and within the unprotected community, there are people who are at risk, meaning at risk for deportation or who are deportees already. So while you are a deportee, you're in deportation proceedings, and if you're deported, that can mean that you exit the country, but if you're deported, that can also mean that you're returned. So you can be in this country post-deportation, and those are people most at risk and unprotected within this community. So there are people who are unprotected but not at risk because they're not in deportation proceedings, which is the second portion of the spectrum. And then there are people who have protected statuses. So within protected statuses, this does give someone certain rights, but not all of them, definitely not citizenship rights. So here we have the DACA people, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. There's people who have advanced parole who request small permissions to exit the country. And then there's people who have TPS, which is a permission that's not different than DACA, but I think it's mostly for Central American people. So what I've talked about and what I've kind of began to think about after conversations with Fede is that undocumentedness spectrum, right, ends at the gray line that you see in this graph, marks embodiment. So everybody inside the undocumented spectrum has either been undocumented or is undocumented today. Now, in the Undoc spectrum, that also includes refugees and asylum seekers, people who have previously naturalized, people who are currently naturalizing, because as you're naturalizing, you get some level of protection, and people who are formally undocumented regardless of status, which may or may not also include some citizens. I'm personally a citizen of the United States by naturalization who is formally undocumented, but I've also embodied undocumentedness. So within Undoc Spectrum, this is where you will find everyone who has lived the experience or is currently living undocumented. So beyond that, you have the undocumented diaspora, which is people who are adjacent to undocumentedness. Now there's different levels of adjacency to undocumentedness, right? It means something completely different, that your parents are undocumented, that your partner is undocumented, that your children are undocumented. So for instance, growing up, when I came into this country, for me, I was the only one in the Undoc spectrum, but my entire family was in the Undoc diaspora. So that includes offspring's parents, it includes mixed status families, and it doesn't need to be the immediacy of your household. Because if your tios are undoc, you know what being undoc means. If your madrina's undoc, right? And this means extended family, and it also means visa holding immigrants. So visa holding immigrants are a particularly different bundle that we're not tying into the Undoc spectrum because they come in with a full set of rights, even if it's not citizen rights. But they're not subjugated by the law for labor and all sorts of other things like driving. And it can leave to their country if they so wish to. So beyond that, we have the host society, even though I still think that the host society is part of the undoc diaspora because the host society is affected by undocumentedness, right? Legally speaking, today, we cannot all be equally governed under the law because people in the Undoc spectrum are governed differently. So if we wanted to fully possess citizenship rights under the laws of this country, undocumented people would need to help them too. So I don't assume that you can have it either or. So the host society is the furthest from the Undoc Plus Center, but it's also not completely removed from. So one thing that we need to think about is how all of this challenges the understanding of people beyond statuses. I'm not thinking about who has a visa or who doesn't have a visa for the purposes of thinking about their humanity and thinking about how to create a community with them. But also, we need to be extremely cognizant in this community that not every single person of the community can outwardly say that they're in the community. There's a lot of stigma tied to being undocumentedness. There's a lot of legal implications to outing yourself as undoc, right? I personally was not super comfortable for years and years and years about talking about my own immigrant status. And that happens intergenerationally. So like I know a lot of people who are of younger generations from the harshest parts of the law in the 80s who will never out themselves as undocumented to their families and friends, right? But also one thing that's beyond interesting of this community is that this community is not like the other communities where one single thing lumps us all together, right? Because this community includes trans individuals, queer individuals, Black individuals, AAPI individuals, people who are, disabled, people who are neurodivergent. Like there's undocumentedness affects us all, which is why I'm baffled that arts organizations have not yet considered migration, or for that matter, undocumentedness as a part of their justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. But that's where we are today.
Hola, I'm Mari